Coming up, Eric Wittenberg will present Opening the Gettysburg Campaign, the Battle of Brandy Station, June 9th, 1863. Mr. Wittenberg is an attorney, an award-winning Civil War historian. He's the author of 17 published books. His first book, Gettysburg's Forgotten Cavalry Actions, was named the winner of the Robert E. Lee Civil War Roundtable of Central New Jersey's Batchelder Coddington Literary Award in 1998 as the best new work interpreting the Battle of Gettysburg. He also has published more than 24 articles on the Civil War cavalry operations that have appeared in the Gettysburg Magazine, North and South, Blue and Gray, Hallowed Ground, America's Civil War, and Civil War Times Illustrated. A dedicated preservationist, he sits on the board of advisors of the Trevilian Station Battlefield Foundation and has regularly worked with the Civil War Preservation Trust in helping to save battlefield land. He is an original member of the Central Ohio Civil War Roundtable. He's the vice president of the Buffington Island Battlefield Preservation Foundation and serves on the governor of Ohio's Advisory Commission on the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. Please put your hands together for Mr. Eric Wittenberg.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here this morning. We're going to talk about the events that kicked off the Gettysburg campaign. I'm sure that those of you who have been to multiple talks this week have heard plenty of things about things that happened here at this small town in Pennsylvania, but today we're going to talk about events that actually occurred in Virginia. Once Robert E. Lee obtained permission to invade the North at the end of May of 1863, he ordered a concentration of all of his cavalry forces in Culpeper County, Virginia, in anticipation of the invasion of the North. This concentration of Confederate cavalry, of course, drew the attention of the Union commander, General Joseph Hooker, who was still in command of the Army of the Potomac, and Hooker set out to do something about it. But before we get there, let me introduce you to some of the more important players. This, of course, is General Robert E. Lee, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia. Lee's plan to invade the North anticipated the Army of Northern Virginia heading north and beginning its invasion on the morning of June 9th, 1863. So these plans are going to be interrupted. And we'll see that the interruption of those plans had far-reaching but unpredictable and unforeseen consequences for the Army of Northern Virginia. Joseph Hooker, still in command of the Army of the Potomac, after his disastrous defeat at the Battle of Chancellorsville, May 1 through 5, 1863. Hooker has a couple of weeks left to go in command of the Army. He's been severely rattled by his defeat at Chancellorsville, but he has nevertheless done a good job of getting the Army back together and back into a position where it's able to conduct operations. However, in the wake of the Battle of Chancellorsville, the commander of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, Major General George Stoneman, who was a member of the legendary West Point class of 1846, has left the Army to take medical leave to seek treatment for an absolutely horrific case of hemorrhoids. I know it sounds funny, but it's not. If you're a cavalryman and you spend countless hours in the saddle, can you imagine a more miserable experience than having a terrible case of hemorrhoids? Not to mention the fact that Hooker blamed George Stoneman for the defeat that he suffered at Chancellorsville, and Stoneman was looking for any excuse he could find to get away from Joe Hooker, and he took the opportunity to seek medical leave to go and relieve himself of command of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, and in fact would never command troops again. This means in the Army of the Potomac. So this means that his senior division commander, Alfred Pleasanton, will end up in command of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps temporarily, and then finally in August it was made permanent. Now Pleasanton is an interesting guy, and he's a guy who is not known for being a lead from the front kind of guy. He was pretty much the ultimate lead from the rear soldier. Very politically oriented, very ambitious, seeking to advance Alfred Pleasanton's career over anything else, more than anything. But Pleasanton did have a good eye for talent, and some of the talent that he spots will play an important role in the story we're going to talk about today. But Pleasanton will have with him all three divisions of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, numbering approximately 11,000 men. First Division, commanded by John Buford, 36 years old, born in Woodford County, Kentucky, member of the West Point class of 1848. John Buford was described by many as being the finest cavalry officer produced by the Union during the Civil War. Buford is a no-nonsense regular soldier. He will end up in command at Brandy Station of the right wing of the Cavalry Corps. David McMurtry Gregg commands the 3rd Division. Gregg is a regular officer, having graduated from West Point in 1855. He has served in the cavalry in the West in the years before the war. No officer will command a division of Union cavalry longer than will David McMurtry Gregg. And then finally, the 2nd Division is commanded by this fellow. Living, breathing proof of the truth of the Peter Principle, if ever there was one. Does anybody not know what the Peter Principle is? The Peter Principle: in every hierarchy, each member will rise to his level of incompetence and remain there. Alfred Napoleon DUFFIE, born Napoleon Alexander DUFFIE, born in France, served in the French army during the Crimean War, did rather well as a sergeant, finally won himself a promotion to lieutenant, and during the Crimean War met an American woman who was over in Europe serving as a nurse, fell in love with her, tried to resign his commission so he could come to the United States and marry her, and the French army, which had just promoted him to lieutenant, said no. So DUFFIE took the proverbial French leave, deserted from the French army, migrated to the United States, and in order to cover up his questionable past, his in-laws created a new identity for him. Changed his name to Alfred Napoleon DUFFIE, created this myth that he had been educated at the French Military Academy at St. Cyr, which he had not, and created this new persona. Now remember, this is a guy who's been a sergeant in the French cavalry. He ends up in command of a division by virtue of being the senior colonel of it, when William Woods Averill, who was the original commander of that division, was relieved by Stoneman after the failed Stoneman raid during the Chancellorsville campaign, yet another one of Hooker's favorite scapegoats. And DUFFIE, being the senior colonel, ends up in command of this division, a position that he was far beyond his limited capabilities, and he will not do very well at Brandy Station, meaning that his tenure in command as a division commander is going to last nothing but a few weeks. But in a brilliant stroke of military bureaucracy, shortly after he's relieved of command of this division in the wake of his poor performance at Brandy Station, he gets promoted to brigadier general and transferred out of the Army of the Potomac. So you gotta love Army politics. When Pleasanton marches, he realizes that he's going to need some infantry support, and that infantry support is going to be provided by 2 ad hoc brigades made up of 2 regiments from each infantry corps. And each of those regiments are ones that are known to be reliable and also ones that were good marchers who would be able to keep up with cavalry on the march. The 2 officers assigned to command these ad hoc brigades, one is Brigadier General ADELBERT Ames, just promoted to general after Chancellorsville, formerly the colonel of the 20th Maine. Ames is a West Pointer known as a guy who was a real martinet, but he proves to be a good soldier, and just as a trivial footnote, ends up being the last Union general of the Civil War to die. He lived almost to 1930. This is General David Russell, who will command the other infantry brigade, the one that will march with the left wing of the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps. The left wing consists of Gregg and DUFFIE's divisions, with Gregg in command. The right wing being Buford, who has 3 brigades, as opposed to the 2 brigades of DUFFIE's division, 2 brigades of Gregg's division, as well as Ames's brigade of infantry. Let me give you just a little bit of an overview of what the objective was. As I said, Hooker was very concerned about this large concentration of Confederate cavalry that had accumulated in Culpeper County. He was really worried that this was going to lead to a large-scale raid by this Confederate cavalry into Maryland, or worse still, into Pennsylvania. And the objective that he set for this cavalry expedition was to destroy or disperse the large concentration of Confederate cavalry in Culpeper County. So those are Pleasanton's operational orders. He departs the Army of the Potomac's camps around Falmouth, Virginia, on the morning of the 8th. They spend the night of the 8th, the morning of the 7th, excuse me. They spend the night of the 7th of June camped in and around Catlet Station, which is approximately halfway between Manassas and what will become the Brandy Station battlefield. And then finally on the 8th, they will encamp at the two crossings of the Rappahannock River that are going to be used. Buford's division is going to cross at Beverly's Ford. The other two divisions under DUFFIE and GREGG are going to cross at Kelly's Ford, which is 8 miles further downstream on the Rappahannock River. Now, Pleasanton's going to develop a plan, and the plan is brilliant, but for one problem. It's based on false information. It's based on faulty intelligence. Pleasanton's assumption is that all of this Confederate cavalry is based in and around the town of Culpeper. It is approximately 6 or 7 miles from the Rappahannock River to Culpeper. So the objective is Buford with his brigade of infantry will cross at Beverly's Ford and move on Culpeper from the north. Gregg's division will cross at Kelly's Ford, move on Culpeper from the south in a pincers movement. DUFFIE's division will march along the southern flank of Gregg's division, providing protection and screening from Confederate infantry that's known to be camped in the vicinity. And the two brigades of infantry are to be there to provide support. What Pleasanton did not realize is that all of the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry division was camped right on the banks of the Rappahannock River. So this brilliant plan that Pleasanton has devised is going to be an almost immediate failure. On the night of June 8th, the forces of cavalry, the Union forces, will camp on the northern bank of the Rappahannock River. They'll spend the night there under very strict orders not to light campfires, to maintain silence, because they don't want it getting out that there is Union cavalry there. Now that same day, June 8th, while the Union cavalry is getting into position, at the direct orders of Robert E. Lee, a grand review of the Confederate cavalry is held in the fields of a farmer by the name of John Minor Botts, who was a notorious Unionist who was literally run out of Richmond on a rail. So he ends up in Culpeper County, where he wins this beautiful farm called Auburn Farm in a poker game, playing against a man of suspect mental capacity. So because of this, and that man of suspect mental capacity just happened to be the uncle of the commander of the Confederate Horse Artillery, Major Robert Franklin Beckham, who was indeed a native of Culpeper, Virginia. So Botts is not a popular man. And Jeb Stuart will use every opportunity that he can find to tweak John Minor Botts' nose. So on May 22nd, he holds a review in John Minor Botts' farm fields. He holds a second review on June 5th in anticipation of this expedition north that's going to engage the entire Army of Northern Virginia. Robert E. Lee could not attend that particular review because he was at a meeting in Richmond, so he specifically requested that a third review be held on the 8th that he was going to attend. So Stuart says, okay, fine, if I'm going to have another review, he invites Major General John Bell Hood and his staff to come, and he invites General Hood to invite a few friends. So General Hood shows up with a few friends, his entire division, who come to watch the review. Now there's a lot of friendly jesting that goes on between the infantry and the cavalry. And one of the things that was often heard was the infantrymen would jest at the cavalry and yell at them, "Where's your mule?" So because of this concern about the mules, and because they didn't want to hear this sort of thing with General Lee involved, anybody who had a mule, because there were some who were part of the Confederate cavalry or horse artillery, were ordered to stay back in camp and not participate. But that didn't mean that there wasn't some jesting. So General Lee will spend about 4 or 5 hours that day inspecting the troops. So ride up and down the lines, looking at every cavalryman along the way. Then there'll be some mock charges, and the horse artillery will deploy. All the while, Union scouts are watching this, and they know exactly what's going on. Buford, in fact, will report this back to headquarters that night, that there's been cannonading on the south side of the river, that he believes there's been a review. Grumble Jones, William Edmondson Jones, who commanded a brigade in Stuart's cavalry, was not at all pleased about this review. He felt it was a waste of time and effort. His troops had just finished a lengthy raid into West Virginia. He was not interested in this sort of pomp and circumstance, and it proved to be something that really annoyed him. He was aware that there were Union troops in the area, but he couldn't get anybody to believe him. And he proved prophetic. On the morning of June 8th, with the brigade of Benjamin Franklin Grimes Davis leading the way of Buford's division, Davis, by the way, was not only a Mississippian who remained loyal to the Union, he is indeed a cousin of Confederate President Jefferson Davis. So he's a guy who had some suspect loyalties in the War Department until he proved his loyalties. And he ends up being a very good soldier. He's a West Point trained career regular cavalryman, known as a martinet. He's a difficult personality, but he was a guy that John Buford, of all people, had a vast amount of respect for. Well, Davis will sit in the Rappahannock River about 4 o'clock in the morning on his horse, watching his column of troopers cross at Beverly's Ford in column of fours. They get across the river, expecting to march on to Culpeper, and instead they run into Company A of the 6th Virginia Cavalry, commanded by a fellow named Captain Bruce Gibson, who'd been given the job of picketing the Rappahannock River. And immediately shots ring out. This in turn sends up the alarm to Grumble Jones, whose brigade of cavalry is camped in the area. Jones hears the shots, jumps out of his bedroll, jumps onto his horse bareback without even having an opportunity to put on his uniform jacket, and begins getting his troops in the saddle to move forward. In the meantime, all of the Confederate horse artillery is parked very near the crossing of Beverly's Ford, so that if Buford's division can get there quickly enough, they're going to bag all of the Confederate horse artillery. So it becomes very incumbent on Captain Gibson to delay things. And they delay the Union crossing for a while, and then Davis gets out in front of his troops. And he's out in front by a couple of hundred yards, and an officer, one of the Confederate regiments, a fellow by the name of Lieutenant Robert Owen Allen of the 7th Virginia Cavalry, spots this officer that he recognizes as being a high-ranking officer alone in front of his troops, puts his spurs to his horse, rides over to Grimes Davis. Davis detects the movement, takes his saber, slashes at Robert Allen Owen, misses him, and Lieutenant Allen sticks his pistol up under Grimes Davis's chin, pulls the trigger, and blows him from the saddle, dead before he hits the ground. Davis had turned around to yell, "Come on, 8th New York," as he's approached by this Confederate officer. So immediately, one of the Union brigade commanders has been killed. So this, of course, takes the starch out of their initial advance. They've got to fall back and regroup, and command of this particular division now falls upon, remember, Buford's a wing commander, so command of his division now falls upon Colonel Thomas Casimir Devin, the commander of the other brigade, one of the other brigades assigned to Buford's command. This is Grumble Jones, the commander of this Confederate brigade that's given the task of defending West Point class of 1848. If ever there was somebody whose name suited his personality, it was William Edmondson Jones. And Jones and Jeb Stuart hated each other's guts. They didn't get along at all. Jones called Stuart that whippersnapper, or that pettifogging lawyer. Stuart was an attorney, by the way, for those of you who didn't know that, one of my guys. Jones, in turn, couldn't stand Stuart, and Stuart couldn't stand Jones, but they had a great deal of mutual respect for each other because they both knew that they were both very good at what they did. But it created a difficult working relationship, and finally in September of 1863, Stuart brought court-martial charges against Jones, and the only thing that kept them from going forward was the intervention of Robert E. Lee, who had him transferred to another command. But Jones is going to do the bulk of the fighting at Brandy Station. His troopers will fight for 12 hours that day. So this is the initial foray across the Beverly's Ford by Buford's troops. They cross the Rappahannock River, they break through Captain Jones, they get across Ruffin's Run. You see where Grimes Davis is mortally wounded as the rest of Jones's brigade is deploying. This is Major Charles Whiting, the commander of the Reserve Brigade, which is Buford's 3rd Brigade, consists of the 1st, 2nd, 5th, and 6th United States Cavalry and the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry. Major Whiting has about a week to go before he's about to be cashiered from the Army for drunkenness and for allegedly unpatriotic statements, and he will not do terribly well at Brandy Station. Also hearing the commotion that's taking place is Brigadier General Wade Hampton. 6'3", 240 pounds, not a West Pointer, no military training before the war, reputedly the wealthiest man in the South, personally raised and equipped the Hampton Legion before the war. Hampton is a terribly brave man. He has, one of the things that he was most proud of is at the age of 17, he killed a bear with his bare hands. Hampton personally killed 13 Union soldiers in one-on-one combat during the Civil War. He's a tough customer, and he's also an extremely capable cavalry officer. Again, being an aristocrat, not being a West Pointer, he and Stuart had a bit of a chilly relationship. But there was a great deal of mutual respect there, and for good reason. When Stuart dies in 1864, this is the man who ends up in command of the Cavalry Corps of the Army of Northern Virginia. Why? Because he was flat out a very capable officer. Well, Hampton will also come to the sound of the guns that morning. So now Buford's got in front of him 2 full brigades of Confederate cavalry, and he also has the Confederate horse artillery. Buford doesn't know what's in front of him. So he's going to give an order to Major Robert Morris, Jr., the commander of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, the great-grandson of the financier of the American Revolution, his namesake. He's going to order Major Morris to clear the woods in front. So with 5 companies of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, Major Morris will order a charge. And his troopers will charge right into the teeth of 4 batteries of Confederate horse artillery. It is one of the most remarkable charges of the war. One of the Confederate horse artillerists ultimately will describe it as a charge of conspicuous gallantry. Buford was so impressed by what he saw that morning that from that day forward, for the rest of his life, John Buford referred to the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry as my 7th Regulars. And coming from a crusty old regular soldier like John Buford, that's high praise indeed. The 6th Pennsylvania made it all the way to the mouths of the guns before being repulsed. Major Morris's horse was shot out from under him. He was unhorsed. He was ultimately captured, and in August of 1863 died a miserable death in Libby Prison. Many said it was of a broken heart. And you'll see from the map that Grumble Jones's guys were deployed along the Green Valley Road there, and what happened is they will end up actually causing flanking fire the whole way along this charge by first the 6th Pennsylvania, and ultimately Buford, seeing the trouble the 6th Pennsylvania is having, sends the 6th U.S. in as well. So as they charge into the teeth of these cannons, they're actually taking fire from flank and from front, taking just brutal casualties. Hampton's guys have also deployed upon this plateau, and they also engage, and as you see, we've got a full-scale engagement taking place now. Stuart himself rides over to personally supervise the fighting that takes place. Now, the whole time this is going on, there's no sign of David McMurtry Gregg. Finally, at about 10:30 in the morning, a cannon is heard to bark. And that's Major Robert Morris, Jr., so highly respected, by the way, that even the Richmond newspapers eulogized him after his death. Another man who happened to be along that day was Captain Ulrich Dahlgren, who was a staff officer of the Army of the Potomac who'd been sent by Joe Hooker more or less as a spy. Ulrich Dahlgren had already established himself as being probably the most daring scout in all of the Army of the Potomac. His father was an admiral who was in command of the Atlantic Blockading Squadron off of Charleston, South Carolina, and his father was a good friend of Abraham Lincoln's. And Ulrich Dahlgren will actually be the one to rally the 6th Pennsylvania and lead it back after Major Morris went down. He will be badly wounded during the retreat from Gettysburg and lose a leg. So what will happen is that Stuart's going to hear a gun bark in his rear, and he will end up having to shift troops to meet. Now, in the meantime, things are going to bog down on Buford's front. There's a stone wall along the property, the dividing line between two parcels of property, but specifically on the Richard Hoop's Cunningham farm. And this stone wall will be occupied by Confederate cavalry commanded by Brigadier General William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, the second son of General Robert E. Lee, known as Rooney to friends and Fitzhugh to the family. Rooney Lee is Harvard trained. He's not a professional soldier. He has served during the Mexican War. He has served in the United States Army in the West. Rooney Lee was 6'4" and weighed about 240 pounds, and he rode a very large horse called Fancy, such that one of the Confederate staff officers, after seeing Rooney Lee mounted on Fancy, described him as the largest establishment he'd ever seen. Well, the Battle of Brandy Station will be Rooney Lee's best day of the war. He's going to, of his own initiative, hearing the guns barking at St. James Church where the cavalry charge occurred, will move his brigade forward and occupy this position along the stone wall. He'll deploy horse artillery on some high ground, and he will end up holding that position and keeping Buford's troops in check really for the rest of the afternoon. Now, in the meantime, Alfred Pleasonton has also crossed the Rappahannock River and has now taken personal command of the battlefield. And Buford, he's put Buford on a very short leash. Buford wants to pitch in, and Pleasonton won't allow it. So Buford's just chafing, and there's a lot of skirmishing that goes back and forth. And ultimately, at about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, elements of the 5th United States Cavalry charge the wall. They take a piece of the wall. Buford then gets serious about it. Now, he will bring forward some troops of Ames's infantry, and specifically it's some soldiers from the 2nd Massachusetts and some soldiers from the 3rd Wisconsin. And he'll find the commanding officers of these two companies of infantry, and he'll call them over and he'll say, now mind you, I can't order you, but I would appreciate it if you would clear that wall. So these infantrymen will end up crawling on their bellies across the field so they can't be seen to ultimately get around the flank of the stone wall. And later in the afternoon, they'll drive Rooney Lee's Confederates away. Colonel Thomas Devin, Buford's senior brigade commander after Davis's death. Devin has no military training. He served as an officer in militia cavalry in New York City before the war, known as Buford's hard hitter. John Buford once said of him, "I can't teach Colonel Devin anything about cavalry. He knows more than I do." Very capable officer. This is Rooney Lee. As I said, General Lee's second son. You can see the family resemblance there. And here's the attack on the stone wall that ultimately drives Rooney Lee and his troops away from that stone wall. This is Beverly Holcomb Robertson, who commands one of the brigades assigned to Stuart's command. Robertson is a guy who, again, didn't get along with Stuart at all. They couldn't stand each other. Stuart in particular detested Robertson in large part because this is the man who was his principal rival for the hand of Flora Cook. He begged that Robertson not be assigned to his command, but Robertson has just joined the Army. He has raised two very large, very green regiments of cavalry in North Carolina. They've just come north to join the Army. Robertson's participation in the Battle of Brandy Station lasted approximately 5 minutes. When Gregg's division, followed by DUFFIE's division, cross at Kelly's Ford, some of Robertson's troopers are picketing the ford. They're driven off, they fire a single volley, and then they're out of the battle for the rest of the day. That is 100% of Beverly Robertson's participation in the Battle of Brandy Station. Not a good beginning for what will become a very good brigade of cavalry. So you see what happens is that Gregg crosses. DUFFIE is going to head in the direction of Stevensburg. Gregg is going to take a road in the direction of Brandy Station with his two brigades commanded by Colonel Percy Wyndham and Colonel Judson Kilpatrick leading the way. Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, West Point class of 1861, the first regular Army officer wounded during the war at Battle of Big Bethel, in command of the 2nd New York Cavalry and commands a brigade. This, by the way, take a good look at him. Tonight when you go home, find yourself a picture of his great-grandson, Anderson Cooper, and you'll see the family resemblance. Judson Kilpatrick believed that if he had found glory in the Civil War, he'd be elected president. Believe me, folks, that never happened. So what will happen is that as Kilpatrick's troops attack, they come across the Orange and Alexandria Railroad, headed for some high ground at a place called Fleetwood Hill. Now, Stuart's headquarters was atop Fleetwood Hill. The only people who were there on Fleetwood Hill, because Stuart's supervising the fighting at St. James Church, were his very able adjutant officer, Major Henry Brainerd McClellan of Philadelphia, a first cousin of George McClellan, and one piece of artillery that happened to be there resupplying. Major McClellan spots the advancing Union cavalry column and starts sending orderlies to Stuart to try and warn him there's a threat in his front. Finally, he orders Lieutenant Tuck Carter to open fire with his single gun, and that single artillery shot in turn causes Gregg's column to halt and to shake out into line of battle because it realizes it's going to find resistance. Finally, one of these officers finds Stuart, tells him, "You've got a massive Yankees in your rear, you better do something about it." Stuart puts spurs to his horse, rides over, sees the threat, followed closely behind by Grumble Jones's brigade and ultimately by Wade Hampton's brigade, which disengaged from Buford, leaving only Rooney Lee's brigade to fight John Buford, who's now on a short leash and can't attack. This is Colonel Pierce Manning Butler Young, West Point class of 1861, commander of the Cobb's Legion Cavalry, a good friend of another member of that class, George Armstrong Custer. And Colonel Young will lead his Cobb's Legion Cavalry in a brilliant mounted charge over the crest of Fleetwood Hill that crashes into the head of the Union cavalry column, causing, as Kilpatrick will describe it, it to disperse like feathers on the wind. So this is the fighting for Fleetwood Hill. First, Wyndham's brigade attacks. The 1st New Jersey Cavalry will end up taking heavy losses. They'll lose Percy Wyndham, its commander, badly wounded in the leg. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Broderick, mortally wounded. Major John Shellmeyer, mortally wounded. Captain Henry Washington Sawyer, very severely wounded. So the 1st New Jersey is going to take very heavy losses. In the meantime, Captain Joseph Martin's battery of horse artillery will deploy at the base of the hill. His guns will end up being captured by a charge by the 35th Battalion of Virginia Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Elijah Veers White of Grumble Jones's brigade. After the repulse of Wyndham's column, Kilpatrick's column will attack. Specifically, the 1st Maine will lead this vicious attack, and they're the ones that will be run into by Young's cavalry and ultimately be repulsed. But the scene that will take place in the hills and plains around Fleetwood Hill is everything you would imagine of a cavalry battle, friends. Mounted charges and mounted countercharges, men having solo one-on-one combat with sabers and pistols. It was a romantic scene, everything that you would imagine from watching movies like They Died with Their Boots On. This took place, and it lasted for the better part of 3 hours. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Just a brutal, bloody, hand-to-hand, one-on-one engagement. There's Colonel Sir Percy. How's that for a mustache? Colonel Sir Percy was, by his own admission, a mercenary. He was a guy who was there for his own personal aggrandizement. He'll be badly wounded here at Brandy Station. He'll be relieved of command shortly thereafter, never to serve in the Army of the Potomac again. Why? Because he was charged with being disloyal to the Union and ended up ultimately being cashiered from the Army. So this is the first attack. This is the attack by Wyndham's men, met by Grumble Jones, and the fighting on Fleetwood Hill. And then this is the second attack once Kilpatrick's troops come up. And ultimately, Gregg will end up withdrawing after having taken bloody losses there on Fleetwood Hill. In the meantime, finally, John Buford is given permission to attack Rooney Lee's position. And he will head for the very northern crest of Fleetwood Hill. And his men will briefly capture the northern crest of Fleetwood Hill. Rooney Lee will order a counterattack, and finally the other brigade of Confederate cavalry, which should have been there all day, but didn't get there because orders were not received. Colonel Thomas Taylor Munford, commanding Fitzhugh Lee's brigade, arrives, and another great melee takes place. Another mounted melee. And John Buford left this wonderful description of it. He talks about how they arrived at the northern crest of Fleetwood Hill. They were met by the Confederates, and then these are his words: "Out flew the sabers, and most handsomely they were used." And again, you have hand-to-hand combat. The scene depicted here is a hand-to-hand engagement that took place between Rooney Lee, who is the officer you see on the left, and Captain Wesley Merritt, the commander of the 2nd United States Cavalry. Merritt spotted Rooney Lee, rode over to him and demanded his surrender. Rooney Lee's response: to swing his saber and strike a blow that knocks Merritt's hat from his head. They end up engaged in one-on-one combat. Rooney Lee will end up with a saber slash and also will end up being shot in the leg, and will ultimately be captured in the days after the Battle of Brandy Station, much to his father's consternation. So this is a depiction of the fighting that takes place between the regulars and Rooney Lee's guys, and during this part of the engagement, the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry will make yet another mounted charge. Its second major charge of the day, and again will take even more losses. Colonel Thomas Taylor Munford, commanding Fitzhugh Lee's brigade. Fitzhugh Lee was the favorite nephew of General Lee. He was a little guy, about 5'3". He was very much Jeb Stuart's protege. They called him the Laughing Cavalier. Fitz Lee was a guy who was prone to being obese, and by the time he ended up back in the United States Army for the Spanish-American War, at 5'3", weighed over 300 pounds, and was wider than he was tall. He's also a beautiful example of the joys of nepotism. Had he not been the favorite nephew of the commanding general of the Army of Northern Virginia, he might have made a pretty good regimental sergeant major. In 40 years of studying the American Civil War and of studying cavalry operations, I've identified exactly 4 good days that Fitz Lee had in the war. This was not one of them. He was suffering from rheumatism and was not even present on the battlefield. So when Munford and his men arrive, their arrival finally persuades Buford that it's time for his command to break off and withdraw. He's been given discretionary orders by Pleasanton that say he can break off and withdraw at his leisure. And this is the fighting for U Ridge and then at the crest of Fleetwood Hill. And ultimately Buford, protected by the newly arrived 1st United States Cavalry, which serves as his rear guard, breaks off and withdraws back across Beverly's Ford, unmolested by the Confederate cavalry. In the meantime, there's one last piece of this battle we need to talk about, and that's the fighting at Stevensburg. This is Colonel Luigi Palma di Cesnola, an Italian count, who commanded one of the brigades in Duffie's division. They're going to make a charge against troopers of the 2nd South Carolina Cavalry who are there guarding Stevensburg. In the process of this fighting, they'll be reinforced by the 4th Virginia Cavalry, the Black Horse Cavalry, which will be routed in the process. Lieutenant Colonel Frank Hampton, the younger brother of Wade Hampton, will be mortally wounded, and then the Union Cavalry will press on to Stevensburg, which is a hamlet there that you see. This is Colonel Williams Wickham, Fitz Lee's father-in-law. Not a good day for him. And this is Colonel Matthew Calbraith Butler, the commander of the 2nd South Carolina Cavalry, Wade Hampton's protege. Butler will then retreat back across a creek that Buford will describe later that summer as being a vicious little stream called Mountain Run. He'll be seated on his horse, bench legs, talking with Stuart's favorite scout, Will Farley. And Union artillery deploys on a piece of high ground at Stevensburg, commanded by Lieutenant Alexander Pennington, Battery M, 2nd United States Artillery. Pennington sees these 2 officers sitting on their horses, personally aims his gun, personally pulls the lanyard, and that single artillery shot kills Farley's horse, kills Butler's horse, takes off Will Farley's leg in a mortal wound, and takes off Matthew Calbraith Butler's foot. Farley managed to keep his sense of humor as they're going to gather him up on a stretcher to remove him from the field. He says to the men who are carrying him off, "Please bring my leg, I've grown rather attached to it." But Farley won't survive the day. He'll be buried later that day in Culpeper. Butler, in fact, will return to duty in 1864 and take command of a division, even though he's one-legged, and will actually serve as a one-legged major general during the Spanish-American War. So finally, DUFFIE drives off this force at Stevensburg, and as they finally make their march to Brandy Station to join Gregg, they find Gregg's column pulling away, ending the Battle of Brandy Station. It lasted for 14 hours. And one myth that was put to rest that day was the old saw that the infantrymen like to say, whoever saw a dead cavalryman? There were plenty of them that day. The Union command took nearly 1,000 casualties. Stuart's command took nearly 800. And there were plenty of dead cavalrymen to be found. Alfred Pleasonton would claim that he captured Stuart's field desk that day and in turn discovered the orders for the invasion of the North. That didn't happen. This, by the way, is Captain Will Farley, who I described to you. And that never happened. He didn't capture Stuart's field desk. And in fact, if you look at the Battle of Brandy Station, you think about what were the objectives. The orders to Pleasonton: destroy or disperse the big concentration of Confederate cavalry. Failed to do that. Left Stuart in command of the battlefield at the end of the day. So strategically, it was a Confederate victory. Tactically, it was a Confederate victory. But you cannot overstate the importance of the Battle of Brandy Station. Henry Brainerd McClellan, Stuart's able adjutant general, said, Brandy Station made the Union cavalry. From that moment forward, the Union cavalry fought Stuart's vaunted troopers on equal terms, boot to boot, stirrup to stirrup, saddle to saddle. 12 days later, at the Battle of Upperville on June 21st, for the first time, Stuart's troopers were driven from the field, ultimately leading to the great fight on East Cavalry Field here at Gettysburg on July 3rd, where David McMurtry Gregg bested Stuart. Now, I want to leave you with one thought. The invasion of the North was supposed to begin on June the 9th. Because of the Battle of Brandy Station, it didn't begin until June 10th. And Stuart's troopers, who had prisoners of war to deal with and a lot of casualties to take care of and a lot of dead men to bury, would not march until the 15th, instead of marching the day they were supposed to. So imagine, if you will, that there's not a big fight at Brandy Station and the Army of Northern Virginia marches on June 9th instead of June 10th. That puts the Army here at Gettysburg a day earlier. That in turn means that John Buford does not get to choose the high ground at Gettysburg for the Union Army to defend. It means Robert E. Lee gets to fight a battle north of the Mason-Dixon line on ground of his own choosing. So when you think about Brandy Station, that's the thought I want you to take away with you. Think about what that consequence was. Obviously, nobody had the ability to foresee it or predict it. But it opened the door for what becomes a Union victory here in Gettysburg. And with that, I'll take your questions.
Sorry. That's how we like to wake everybody up. Anyway, that was a great lecture on the cavalry and battles, of course, talking about Brandy Station in particular. When you were talking during this, though, I noticed that Pleasonton, he doesn't get mentioned very much. I assume it's because he's arriving late on the battlefield and he's left things basically to John Buford and David Gregg, and they're the ones really exercising command on that battlefield, and it's really not Pleasonton.
That's correct.
So I always wonder, after things that other commanders higher up would say, by the time you get to Gettysburg, why don't we make another command change with Pleasonton and put someone else in there, so that, the Cavalry Corps, having gained experience now and, feeling more confident, might go into Gettysburg a little better prepared overall, because Pleasonton's still he's a good desk general.
He's an excellent desk general, and he's got a good eye for talent, but The answer to your question is that there's already enough changing horses in midstream going on, number one. Number two, Pleasanton was at least a known commodity. George Gordon Meade in particular knew him very well. Think about what Meade did in the years prior to the war. He built lighthouses. The superintendent of the federal bureaucratic organization that was responsible for that was Alfred Pleasanton's father, Stephen. So Meade knew Alf Pleasanton very well. And because he knew Alf Pleasanton very well, I think the decision was ultimately made to keep him in command. And Pleasanton will indeed remain in command until finally the winter of 1864, when he stabs Meade in the back during the testimony before the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And finally, Meade says, all right, I'm done with you, at which point he is relieved from command and sent to Missouri, where, ironically enough, he does quite well and actually commands troops in the field. But Pleasanton was not a lead from the front kind of guy, and he demonstrated it in spades at Brandy Station. That's a good question, David.
Eric, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I've got a couple of general cavalry questions. First off, does the cavalry slash at each other from the back, or was it, gallantry and they're face to face?
Billy Ray, I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Okay. There you go. The cavalry, did they slash from each other from the back, or was it just general, polite battle?
The question was, when cavalry fought mounted and there was saber fighting, would it be from the rear or would it be from the front? Question is, whatever got the job done, because you're fighting for your life. There was a question back there.
Yes, is the Dahlgren, that's apartment of Dahlgren, is that the same one that leads?
Is the ULRIC Dahlgren that is involved at Brandy Station the same Dahlgren that leads the raid into the Deep South to try and take Richmond in 64?
You betcha.
With one leg?
You betcha.
Yes, do you think if we didn't have Brandy Station, do you think that Jeb Stuart's role in assisting Lee would have been different in Gettysburg?
Question was, if we didn't have Brandy Station, would Stuart's role have been different during the Gettysburg campaign? The answer is, I don't believe it would have made a hill of beans worth of difference. Stuart's troopers performed magnificent work up to and including June 21st at Upperville. And the orders for him to go on his so-called ride aren't issued until June 22nd. So it had nothing to do with Brandy Station. And I know that a lot of modern historians like to play armchair psychiatrist and try and psychoanalyze Jeb Stuart from, more than a century after his death, and saying that he went on this ride to redeem himself after Brandy Station. Well, there's no doubt he got excoriated in the Richmond newspapers after Brandy Station for getting surprised. But the truth is that once he got over the surprise, he fought a really good tactical battle. And if you read his letters home to his wife Flora after the Gettysburg campaign, he doesn't talk about anything other than about how the Richmond papers lie. And he talks about what a good time he had in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to suggest to you that if his feelings were so hurt and he felt so compelled to redeem himself, he would have told Flora. And it never happened. So I have a hard time buying that theory.
Where is Custer during Brandy Station? Where is Custer during the Brandy Station battle?
The question was, where was George Armstrong Custer during the Battle of Brandy Station? With Alfred Pleasanton as a staff officer. He'll end up making one charge, but he is a lieutenant at that time and has no command. It's interesting, the night before the battle, he'll write a letter to his sister saying that we're about to go on this raid and we're about to have a big battle, and should anything happen to me, I want you to burn my letters, and a trunk will be sent to you. I will suggest to you that what was in that trunk was that gaudy brigadier general's uniform that he was waiting to put on, that he will get to wear by the time he gets to here at Gettysburg on July 3rd, 1863. So, but at Brandy Station, he's nothing but a lieutenant on Pleasanton's staff.
When Buford wanted to go in, Pleasanton held him back. Was there a reason Pleasanton held him back, or he just wasn't sure what to do?
Pleasanton never said, but I will speculate that he just didn't have the killer instinct to launch an all-out attack on both fronts at the same time. Because Stuart would not have had the forces with only 3 brigades available. Because remember, Munford doesn't come until late in the afternoon. Stuart would only had three brigades available. Had he been fully pressed by 2 divisions in simultaneous attacks, he would not have had the forces to resist. He would have been driven from the field. Anybody else?
Just out of curiosity, given your expertise in cavalry operations and stuff, what do you think of the Dahlgren letter?
Well, there's an interesting question. Since you touched on the Dahlgren raid, Ulrich Dahlgren will end up returning to duty after losing his leg and nearly dying, will return to duty with a wooden leg in February of 1864, just in time to lead part of what becomes called the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid on Richmond, the stated objective of which was to free Union prisoners of war at Libby Prison in Belle Isle. That raid will be repulsed from Richmond. An ambush will kill Ulrich Dahlgren, and found on Dahlgren's body were certain papers that suggested that the true objective of the raid was not just the freeing of the prisoners of war, but also the kidnapping and assassination of Jefferson Davis and his cabinet, and the burning of the city of Richmond. When these documents were found, they were ultimately photographed, and copies of the photographs were sent by General Lee with a letter under flag of truce across the lines asking George Meade, was this indeed the policy of the United States government? And Meade does something that he finds very distasteful, because he talks about it in a letter to his wife, but he disavows Ulrich Dahlgren. After his death, his father, Admiral Dahlgren, will spend a great deal of time trying to defend his son's honor, and he will make claims for years that these papers were forgeries. The papers themselves will not survive. In the days after the end of the war, Edwin Stanton will have them ordered up and brought to his office, and they never are returned. They probably ended up in Stanton's fireplace, but there were photographic copies of them that survived. Now, Admiral Dahlgren was an incredible pack rat. He saved every piece of paper that he ever got in his life, including all of his correspondence with his son, Ulrich, every single letter, and Ulrich's diary, which was returned to him. So, and then after he died, his widow donated all this stuff to the Library of Congress. So there's a very large collection of Ulrich Dahlgren's own handwriting at the Library of Congress. And in 1958, a historian by the name of Virgil Carrington Jones wrote a book called 8 Hours Before Richmond about the Kilpatrick Dahlgren raid, and he hired a police handwriting expert to do an analysis based on the actual exemplars of Dahlgren's handwriting versus the photographs of the documents. And this police forensic handwriting analyst, and I have one of 2 known copies of the report, came to the conclusion, which was one I wholeheartedly endorse just from my own familiarity with Ulrich Dahlgren's handwriting, that those papers were 100% authentic. So that leaves us with a question, because 3 weeks before the raid, Ulrich Dahlgren had a one-on-one meeting with Abraham Lincoln. And the only record of that meeting is a cryptic notation that Ulrich Dahlgren made in his diary, where he said they talked of political or matters of a political and military nature. And that's all he said, so we don't know what was specifically discussed. But it leaves you with the fascinating question, and to borrow a line from the Watergate era, what did Lincoln know, and when did he know it? And that makes for an interesting what if. There's a question back there, Brooke, I think, or are we out of time? We're out of time. I'll be signing inside the Visitor Center, so if you have any further questions, please come see me. And I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Wittenberg.